I get a kiss just for introducing. I'm thrilled that you're here, and I'm thrilled my friend Jackie Woodson is here. She is the author of picture books and middle school books and young adult books and poetry books, and now a book for adults. I always feel like I should say grown-ups in that particular list. She has won so many awards that I wrote a few of them down for fear I would forget. But she is the Young People's Poet Laureate, which is a big deal, and she's going everywhere with that. She is the winner of a Newbery Honor Medal, a couple of them, I think, Coretta Scott King Award, the National Book Award, the Caldecott Medal. But here's what I want to tell you about my friend and about her writing. She isn't like anyone else. Her voice is so specifically her own that there are no comparables. You don't say, Jackie reminds me of this person or that person. She reminds me of no one but herself, and I can hardly think of anyone else I would say that about. And the other thing that I would say about her is that she is genuinely limitless. Not only can she write in all of these different forms, she's an activist, she's out in the community. I would not put it past her to be the person who cures cancer in the next 10 years. I feel so strongly that there's nothing that she can't do, and it is my great honor to introduce my friend, Jacqueline Woodson.
It's awesome to be here, and it's funny because when I would tell people, writers, that I'm going to Parnassus, I'm going to be doing a reading with Parnassus, this bookstore is legendary in New York City, especially really among writers, but the first question they ask is, how did you get there? And the second question is, are you going to meet Ann Patchett? And then I do my name dropping and say, I already know her. And then they get really jealous. So it's great to be back in Tennessee. The last time I was here, it was when I was at Innsworth School some years ago. And then I've been trying to come for a long time to read from Brown Girl Dreaming. Ann's been inviting me, and it didn't work out. And so now it's worked out because I'm here as part of my book tour for Another Brooklyn, but I'm going to cheat and read from Brown Girl Dreaming and Another Brooklyn. And Ann and I met back in Provincetown many, many years ago. I won't even say how long because you'll go, oh, y'all aren't that old. But it was a while back, and it's amazing to have writers in your life because I don't know how many of you in the audience are writers, but writers get you, and they get how crazy you can be at times. They get how hard this journey is, and we both also have in common that our partners are physicians, which is great, a great pairing because they don't want to be writers, and they know that the work they're doing is important too, and they can leave the house during the day and leave your crazy behind there to do what you need to do. So I wrote Another Brooklyn for a lot of reasons, but one was to really investigate what it means to grow up girl in this country, and what it means to grow up and not have your girls. I've met a lot of women who have talked about not having women friends. I have guy friends. I can't trust women, or I don't like women. I get along better with guys. And I just think, but how do you walk through the world without your people, without the people who have been so much a part of you? So I wanted to start by reading a bit from Another Brooklyn and then from Brown Girl Dreaming. So Another Brooklyn is a novel. And when I was writing Brown Girl Dreaming, I wrote a lot about where I was growing up, which was a neighborhood called Bushwick. And as I was writing about Bushwick, I realized that Bushwick was changing. It had started out as this neighborhood that was Black and Latino in Brooklyn, and it was on the edge of white flight when my family moved there. So white people were moving to Long Island, to Westchester, to Queens, and Black and Latino families were moving in through the Great Migration for the better opportunity that America promised. And now Bushwick has changed, and it's much more of a hipster neighborhood. I was listening to, I think it was Leonard Lopate. Maybe it wasn't, but who's the other NPR person that's not Leonard Lopate, the skinny guy who, anyway, he was interviewing someone about tequila, and he said, so it's like the Bushwick of tequila, which meant that it was a very cool tequila. And I thought, wow, Bushwick has become that. And I really wanted to put the Bushwick that I had known as a child on the page. So I think it's important that we do have this history of the places we live in, that they're not these places that just suddenly get discovered by someone, but they're places that have a history for people. So Bushwick on the page in this novel is a true place, and everything that's happening in that Bushwick was actually happening at the time that I talk about it happening in the book. And then around that true place, I developed this narrative of these 4 girls, Sylvia, Angela, Gigi, and August, who is telling the story. Page 14. Years erase us. Sylvia sinking back into the dust of the world before I knew her. Her baby gone, then her belly, then breast, and finally only the deep gap in my life where she had once been. Angela fading next across the years. Just a faint voice on the answering machine when I was home on college break. I only just heard about Gigi, so awful. Were you there? Promises to reconnect when both of us were next in New York. Promises she'd find me again. So much air around the lies distance allowed us to tell as she sank back into the world she had become a part of. A world of dancers and actors redrawn into royalty without a past. Gigi. Each week, Sister Sonia said, start at the beginning. Her dark fingers bending around a small black notebook, pen poised. Many moments passed before I opened my mouth to speak. Each week I began with the words, I was waiting for my mother. The office was small, ivy cascading down from a tiny pot on an otherwise stark windowsill. Maybe it was the ivy that kept me coming back. Every week I spent 40 minutes, my eyes moving from the ivy to Sister Sonia's hijab, to her fingers closed around the notebook and pen. Maybe I spoke only because each week I was allowed to look into the brown, angled face of a woman and believe again that my mother was coming soon. I know when I get there, my brother and I used to sing, the first thing I'll see is the sun shining golden, shining right down on me. How did I get there, to that moment of being asked to start at the beginning? Who had I become? She's coming, I'd say, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. What about your friends? Sister Sonia asked. Where are they now? We're waiting for Gigi, I'd say. Everyone's waiting for Gigi. Sylvia, Angela, Gigi, August. We were 4 girls together, amazingly beautiful and terrifyingly alone. This is memory. In eastern Indonesia, families keep their dead in special rooms in their homes. They're dead, not truly dead, until the family has saved enough money to pay for the funeral. Until then, the dead remain with them, dressed and cared for each morning, taken on trips with the family, hugged daily, loved deeply. So August is looking back on her life, and at this point she is an anthropologist studying the rituals of death and dying. Before Sylvia, Gigi, and Angela were mine, they arrived at our public school each morning, far away from me. They called to each other across the yard. They linked arms and laughed. They curled into, page 34. They curled into each other to whisper when the teacher's back was turned. Before I knew their names, I knew the tiny bones at the back of their necks, the tender curve of their hairlines. I knew each Peter Pan collared shirt and turtleneck they owned. I knew Angela's scowl as she waited in line in the lunchroom. I knew Sylvia's bronze arm draped around Angela's waist in the schoolyard. I knew Gigi's voice, a waxed-on Spanish or British or German accent as we pledged in the auditorium. Each teacher who entered the schoolyard loved them best, the rest of us sinking into invisibility. Before they were mine, I stared at the back of their necks, watched their perfect hands close around jump ropes and handballs, saw their brightly polished nails. As they grabbed each other's arms and bounce-walked down the hall, I was sure no ghost mothers existed in their past. I truly believed they were standing steadily in the world. I watched them, wanting to have what they had, 6 feet planted, right here, right now. That year, before we all grew to one height, Sylvia was the tallest. The day we finally became friends, Angela wore a too small coat, her thin, pale arms protruding from the sleeves. My own jacket was also too small, so I met her eyes first, hoping she'd see we came from the same place, a place where we cornrowed our hair and were unprepared for how quickly winter settled over the city. The sadness and strangeness I felt was deeper than any feeling I'd ever known. I was 11, the idea of 2 identical digits in my age still new and spectacular and heartbreaking. The girls must have felt this. They must have known where had 10, 9, 8, and 7 gone, and now the 4 of us standing together for the first time, it must have felt like a beginning, an anchoring. I held my nearly flat book bag with both hands. "Why do you stare at us like that?" Sylvia said. "What are you looking for?" Years later, I remember how shaky her voice was, how I wondered if it was the cold or fear that made it quiver. And in it, there was a slight lilt of Martinique, an island as foreign to me as the Bronx. Sylvia came closer to me. "Really, I'm asking what you are seeing. When you look at us, I'm not trying to be mean." "Everything," I said. "I see everything." "You're the one without the mother, aren't you?" Sylvia touched my cheek, her mouth so close I could smell her wild cherry lifesaver. "No, that's not me." It was years before the woman with the hijab, years before the silence and afternoon of watching ivy cascade down from a windowsill, a pen stilled in a thin, dark hand. The sky was overcast, the school bell was ringing. All around us, children were running toward the entrance. Sylvia took my hand. "You belong to us now," she said. And for many years, it was true. "What did you see in me?" I'd ask years later. "Who did you see standing there?" "You look lost," Gigi whispered. "Lost and beautiful. And hungry," Angela added. "You look so hungry." And as we stood there in the bright light, in the bright schoolyard, we saw the lost and beautiful and hungry in each of us. We saw home. And this last section is page 65. In 1968, the children of Biafra were starving. My brother was not yet born, and I was too young to understand what it meant to be a child, to be Biafran, to starve. Biafra was a country that lived only inside my mother's admonitions: "Eat your peas, there are children starving in Biafra." And in the empty-eyed, brown, big-bellied children moving across my parents' television screen. But long after Biafra melted back into Nigeria, the country from which it had fought so hard to succeed, the faces and swollen bellies of these children haunted me. In a pile of old magazines my father kept on our kitchen table in Brooklyn, I found a copy of Life with 2 genderless children on the cover and the words, "Starving Children of Biafra War," blared across the ragged white garment of the taller child. How do we dream ourselves out of this? I stared at the cover of Life. The children's distrusting eyes stared back at me, too large for their small brown heads, too small for their protruding bones and distended bellies. My mother hadn't lied. There were indeed children suffering. Here was proof. Here they were on the cover of Life magazine. I spent hours stroking their nearly bald heads, running my fingers across their almost beatific faces. If angels truly existed, I thought, they had come to earth as Biafran children, haunted and only halfway here. I'm checking my clock. I'm not checking my messages. So this is the final section. I'm going to read from Another Brooklyn. It took about 3 years to write this book, and I'm usually working on more than one book at a time because when I get bored with one, I move on to the other. When I get bored with that one, I move to the next one. And I was working on Brown Girl Dreaming and thinking about Bushwick, thinking about the gentrification and writing notes on that book. And I didn't know what that book would be, but I knew what I was trying to say and what I wanted to say. I didn't know how I was going to say it. And then finally I was able to say it, much to my family's glee, because I had been really cranky trying to figure out how I was going to say it for a long time. So we promised her she'd be more famous than anyone ever was. We told her no other brown girl had her strange eyes and crazily long hair. We believed ourselves when we said, that's what Hollywood wants, and I can't wait to see you on television, and you'll be more famous than Diane Carroll. Don't trust the altar boys, Sylvia warned, if you're the only altar girl. When she opened her mouth to sing Nina Simone's Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues, our throats throbbed, our teeth locked together. Sylvia lived deep inside those notes, halfway hidden from all of us. They got some hungry women there, and man, they'll sure make a mess out of you. You have to be a singer, we said. You have to. After law, Sylvia said. We tried to hold on. We played double dutch and jacks. We chased the ice cream truck down the block, waving our change-filled fist. We frog jumped over tree stumps, pulled each other into gushing fire hydrants, learned to dance the loose booty to Sly and the Family Stone, hustled to Van McCoy. We bought T-shirts with our names and zodiac signs and iron-on letters. But still, as we slipped deeper into 12, our breasts and butts grew, our legs got long, something about the curve of our lips and the sway of our heads suggested more to strangers than we understood. And then we were heading toward 13, walking our neighborhood as if we owned it. Don't even look at us, we said to the boys, our palms up in front of our faces. Look away, look away, look away. We pretended to believe that we could unlock arms and walk the streets alone, but we knew we were lying. There were men inside darkened hallways, around street corners, behind draped windows, waiting to grab us. We had long lost our razor blades, and none of us had ever truly stopped chewing on our nails. But still, I and I and I and I, we chanted, we and we and we and we. We hand song, down, down, baby, down by the roller coaster, sweet, sweet baby, I'ma never let you go. Because we wanted to believe we were years and years away from sweet, sweet babies. We wanted to believe we would always be connected this way. Sylvia, Gigi, and Angela had moved far past my longest fingernail, all the way up my arms. Years had passed since I'd heard my mother's voice. When she showed up again, I introduced her to my friends, say, you were wrong, Mama. Look at us hugging. Look at us laughing. Look how we begin and end each other. Thank you. So interesting. When I was on Terry Gross, she and I were talking about Another Brooklyn, and I Never mind, there are a lot of kids in the audience. Never mind. So I'll save that story for another day. That's one great thing about writing for both audiences, that the audience, mix up. And that's one downside. So I wrote Another Brooklyn for a number of reasons, because I wanted to get Bushwick on the page. And Bushwick is interesting because it was this neighborhood that was founded by the Dutch, and including a guy named Franciscus, the Negro, who was a former slave who bought his freedom. And I didn't know that as a child growing up in that neighborhood, but then I found it out, and it did more than blow my mind. I just thought this is more going toward the amazingness of this neighborhood and the people in it. So when I started writing Brown Girl Dreaming, I knew I wanted to write a memoir about how I became a writer. And I knew that I had to go back into my memory and do a lot of research and try to figure out how I got to this place. So I just started writing down memories and memories and memories, and I didn't know what I was going to do with them. I had, again, all these pieces of paper. I never outlined. I never know where a story's going. I never know how it's going to get there for a long, long time. And I was writing this, and I figured that when I got to the point where I didn't remember anymore, I'd ask my mother. And halfway through the writing of the book, my mother died suddenly. And I realized that door had closed, and I couldn't ask her. There was this gap in what I knew. So I went back to South Carolina, where I had been a child, and interviewed uncles and aunts. I interviewed my sister and my brothers, who don't remember a whole lot, sadly. But and just started mining. And then I thought I was going to write this linear narrative, and realized as I was writing down these memories that it's not how memory comes to us. Memory comes to us in these small moments with all of this white space around it. So then I started restructuring the book so that it was written in verse, and I had to go back and look at the line breaks and look at where the white space happened and how it worked, and really rewrite it. So I ended up rewriting Brown Girl Dreaming probably about 31 times before it was the book you saw as the first edition, and then 32 for the second time, for the second edition, because then I went back. And I think if my editor hadn't snatched it from me, I would still be rewriting it. But because I just read from Another Brooklyn, I want to start with the poem that really got me thinking about Bushwick and wanting to tell that story that became the book that came right after Brown Girl Dreaming. Bushwick History Lesson. Before German mothers wrapped scarves around their heads, kissed their own mothers goodbye, and headed across the world to Bushwick. Before Italian fathers sailed across the ocean for the dream of America and found themselves in Bushwick. Before Dominican daughters donned quinceañera dresses and walked proudly down Bushwick Avenue. Before young brown boys in cut-off shorts spun their first tops and played their first games of skelly on Bushwick streets, before any of that, this place was called Bosvik, settled by the Dutch and Franciscus the Negro, a former slave who bought his freedom. And all of New York was called New Amsterdam, run by a man named Peter Stuyvesant. There were slaves here. Those who could afford to own their freedom lived on the other side of the wall. And now that place is called Wall Street. When my teacher says, "So write down what all of this means to you," our heads bend over our notebooks, the whole class silent, the whole class belonging somewhere, to Bushwick. I didn't just appear one day. I didn't just wake up and know how to write my name. I keep writing, knowing now that I was a long, long, long time coming. I know the poor captioner is about to cut me. So February 12, 1963, page 1. I am born on a Thursday, University Hospital, Columbus, Ohio, USA, a country caught between black and white. I am born not long from the time or far from the place where my great-great-grandparents worked the deep, rich land, dawn till dusk, unfree. Drank cool water from scooped out gorge, looked up and followed the sky's mirror constellation to freedom. I am born as the South explodes, too many people, too many years enslaved, then emancipated, but not free. The people who look like me keep fighting and marching and getting killed so that today, February 12th, 1963, and every day from this moment on, brown children like me can grow up free, can grow up learning and voting and walking and riding wherever we want. I am born in Ohio, but the stories of South Carolina already run like rivers through my veins. So when I started writing Brown Girl Dreaming, and I had all those pieces of paper and all those memories that I was writing and rewriting, I have a good friend, Toshi Regan, who's a singer who came up through the civil rights movement. Her mom started this group called Sweet Honey in the Rock, and so she was part of the Freedom Singers and SNCC. So she was born, she just grew up inside the movement. And whenever I'm stuck with the book, we go out and have breakfast. And, I complain and whine. And so I was complaining and whining about Brown Girl Dreaming, saying, here's this book I'm trying to write, and I don't know where it's going, and I'm trying to talk about my life, and nothing was happening in my life. And she's like, what are you talking about? The South was on fire when you were born. And it completely unlocked me and helped me begin to structure this book and start from the very beginning. And you just need that. You need the friend who unlocks you. As a writer, a girl named Jack. Good enough name for me, my father said the day I was born. I don't see why she can't have it too. Page 6. But the women said no. My mother first, then each aunt pulling my pink blanket back, patting the crop of thick curls, tugging at my new toes, touching my cheeks. We won't have a girl named Jack, my mother said. And my father's sisters whispered, a boy named Jack was bad enough, but only so my mother could hear. Name a girl Jack, my father said, and she can't help but grow up strong. Raise her right, my father said, and she'll make that name her own. Name a girl Jack, and people will look at her twice, my father said, for no good reason but to ask if her parents were crazy, my mother said. And back and forth it went until I was Jackie, and my father left the hospital mad. My mother said to my aunts, hand me that pen, wrote Jacqueline, where it asked for a name. Jacqueline, just in case someone thought to drop the IE. Jacqueline, just in case I grew up and wanted something a little bit longer and further away from Jack. So, how many people have read Brown Girl Dreaming? So my mom and dad separated when I was 2 months old. And the reason I know so much about their story is because when I was 12 or 13, they got back together, which I don't recommend. Just in case anyone's thinking about it. The great thing about it was I got to meet the whole Woodson side of my family. And so I guess that was some good to come out of it, but that's about the end of it. The ghost of the Nelsonville house. So I was born in Columbus, and my family moved between, my grandparents lived in Nelsonville, and they were the only black family in this town of Nelsonville. And my grandfather was a politician there in Nelsonville. And when I was 14, my best friend Maria, who you meet in Brown Girl Dreaming, and I went to Nelsonville. And it was the first time I realized you could go someplace and not blend. And so we ended up getting in a fight with these girls who were talking junk to us, and we were from New York, so we weren't going to take it. And we got back home to my grandmother's house like an hour later, and she's like, I heard you got in a fight with those Turner girls. We're like, what? I mean, this was miles from the house, but it was that kind of town where we realized that they know who you are. It'll be scary sometimes. My great-great-grandfather on my father's side was born free in Ohio, 1832. Built his home and farmed his land, then dug for coal when the farming wasn't enough. Fought hard in the war, his name in stone now on the Civil War Memorial. William J. Woodson, United States Colored Troops, Union Company B, 5th Regiment. A long time dead, but living still among the other soldiers on that monument in Washington, D.C. His son was sent to Nelsonville, lived with an aunt, William Woodson, the only brown boy in an all-white school. You'll face this in your life someday, my mother will tell us over and over again. A moment when you walk into a room and no one there is like you. It'll be scary sometimes, but think of William Woodson, and you will be all right. So I was reading at a bookstore called Politics and Prose in Washington, D.C., and NPR was there. They were interviewing me at the reading Code Switch, and then we were going to go over to the Civil War Memorial to find my great-great-grandfather's name. And I had gotten this story from my aunt, my father's sister, who's a genealogist. And so I never researched it or anything. I just figured she was telling me the truth. And so NPR is there. They have their cameras and everything. They're all excited. I'm like, oh, goodness, please let this be true. So I'm walking over to the Civil War Memorial really, really, really slowly. And when we get there, and Kat Chow actually gets there before me, and she's found his name. And I bend down and see it, and I just start crying because it's one thing to hear these stories, but another thing to see them physically and know that we were here. Uncle Odell. 6 months before my big sister is born, my Uncle Odell is hit by a car while home in South Carolina on leave from the Navy. When the phone rang in the Nelsonville house, maybe my mother was out hanging laundry on the line, or down in the kitchen speaking softly with her mother-in-law, Grace, missing her own mother back home. Maybe the car was packed and ready for the drive back to Columbus, the place my father called the big city, now their home. But every Saturday morning, they drove the hour to Nelsonville and stayed till Sunday night. Maybe right before the phone rang, tomorrow was just another day. But when the news of my uncle's dying traveled from the place he fell in South Carolina to the cold March morning in Ohio, my mother looked out into a gray day that would change her forever. Your brother, my mother heard her own mother say, and then there was only a roaring in the air around her, a new pain where once there wasn't pain, a hollowness where only minutes before she had been whole. So I'm going to read about 3 more. Oh, no, I just remembered that page thing again. I'm so sorry. I'm getting it. So back in the day, family members were allowed to tell their kids which one was their favorite. And you kind of can't, it's against the law or something now. You have to say, I love you all the same, or I love you both the same. And we know we're lying. But back in the day, there was a different kind of transparency. I knew I was my grandfather's favorite. I knew my uncle adored my sister. I knew my 2 brothers were adored by my grandmother and mother because they would say, Hope and Roman are our favorites. And my grandfather would say, well, Jackie, you're my favorite. And it just was. So as long as everyone had a favorite, you were okay. Not like we knew because we didn't really pay that much attention, only to the relative that we were the favorite of because we knew we could get all kinds of stuff from them. And my grandfather, this was my grandfather on my mother's side, Gunnar, who died young. This is page 100, Tobacco. Summer is over, a kiss. I'm sorry, for those who haven't read Brown Girl Dreaming, I was born in Ohio, Then I moved to Greenville, South Carolina. When my mother and father separated, my mother took us back home to her people in Greenville, South Carolina. I stayed there till I was 7 years old, and then we moved to New York City. So I went north, south, then north again. It's page 100, tobacco. Summer is over, a kiss of chill in the southern air. We see the dim orange of my grandfather's cigarette as he makes his way down the darkening road. Hear his evening greetings and the coughing that follows them. Not enough breath left now to sing, so I sing for him in my head where only I can hear. Where will the wedding supper be? Way down yonder in a hollow tree. The old people used to say a pinch of dirt in the mouth can tell tobacco's story. What crops are ready for picking, what needs to be left to grow, what soil is rich enough for planting, and the patches of land that need a year of rest. I do not know yet how sometimes the earth makes a promise it can never keep. Tobacco fields lay fallow, crops picked clean. My grandfather coughs again, and the earth waits for what and who it will get in return. So the town we lived in was called Nickeltown, and it's a black town inside Greenville, South Carolina. And it's still pretty segregated. And then we go to Brooklyn, to Bushwick. So I think I'm going to read 3 more. My uncle came back home. My uncle had been incarcerated, like so many people. And when he came back home, he had converted to the Nation of Islam. And so we were raised Jehovah's Witnesses, and I think my mom thought there wasn't enough religion in the house. So we also were practicing Muslims. And so there was a lot of praying, and there was a lot of time to be very bored and to create narratives in your head. But it's interesting to have grown up in both those worlds. I didn't know that there was a rift between Muslims and Christians. I was like, aren't we all the same? And I didn't know that Walt Whitman said, "Are you not concerning God?" Right? And it was kind of this mantra in our house, whatever people believed, you let them have their belief, because faith is such an important thing for people. So it was never a question when someone said, well, my religion is Catholicism or I'm Buddhist. It's like, yeah, we're Muslim and Christian. So it just was. But for those of you who don't know, Jehovah's Witnesses aren't allowed to pledge the flag. They're not allowed to celebrate holidays. They're not allowed to celebrate birthdays. They're not allowed. There's a lot of things we weren't allowed to do. My partner now is Jewish. I celebrate every holiday there is. And February is Jacqueline Woodson birthday month, in case anybody wanted to join in on the festivities. But, Hanukkah, we got it. Eid, we got it. Kwanzaa, we got it. Christmas, we got it. And, but it is interesting to have grown up inside the world where you were kind of outside of the world, because it's kind of who we are as writers, too. You're kind of on the outside watching the world. The Promised Land. When my uncle gets out of jail, he isn't my uncle anymore. He is Robert the Muslim and wears a small black kufi on his head. And even though we know we witnesses are the chosen ones, we listen to the stories he tells about a man named Muhammad and a holy place called Mecca and the strength of all black people, page 300. We sit in a circle around him, his hands moving slow through the air, his voice calmer and quieter than it was before he went away. When he pulls out a small rug to pray on, I kneel beside him, wanting to see his Mecca, wanting to know the place he calls the Promised Land. Look with your head, he tells me, his own head bowed. It's out there in front of you. You'll know it when you get there. So my younger brother ate paint, which we never understood. He would pick the plaster off the wall and eat it. And we weren't hungry, so, he was just a freak. But as a result, growing up, he was in the hospital a lot for lead poisoning. And it was something that a lot of city kids got because back in the day, there was lead in the paint. And one thing I get asked a lot is, how is he? And he's fine. He's still a little bit of a nut bucket, but he's 6'4" and very much alive. So I'm going to read two more. I'm going to read Pastels and Benil, which is on page 255, because we were talking about friendship. And Maria is still a very, very close friend of mine from childhood. One thing that Junot Diaz does so well is he interweaves the Spanish language with the English language. And I grew up speaking Spanish and English, and one of the things that I didn't see when I started writing, one of the reasons I wrote was because I loved writing. I loved telling stories. I got in trouble for lying all the time, and I had a teacher who said, instead of lying, write it down, because then it's fiction. And it was kind of this moment for me of realizing that this thing that I love doing could be legitimized. And I didn't see the stories of my childhood on the page. There were some early people I read, like Virginia Hamilton, Toni Morrison, Langston Hughes, John Steptoe, but there was this kind of gap in the work that mirrored the experiences I was having as a child. And one thing about seeing reflections of yourself in literature is it allows you to feel legitimized in the world, like you're part of a bigger world and a greater good. And when there's that absence in the literature, you feel like you're not part of the bigger narrative. So I wanted to write to fill that gap. And I think growing up, there were a lot of books that were windows into these other worlds, into the worlds of other people's experiences, predominantly white experiences that were not telling my story. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a Sally Hemings scholar. You'll appreciate this, Robin. So Sally Hemings is our connection, the Woodson connection to Sally Hemings is she is like my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. She's the one who had all the children with Thomas Jefferson. At first they said Thomas Jefferson was never with Sally Hemings, and then they're like, he was with her, but he didn't have any children. And they're like, yeah, he had some children, but it wasn't you. And then finally, they did all the DNA testing and traced the Woodson path back. But Sally Hemings had a brother who was James Hemings, and he was the main cook for Thomas Jefferson. And so he was the one who cooked the meal in the room where it happened. So for those of you who have seen Hamilton and know the Hamilton, no one else was in the room where it happened, but he was in the room where it happened. So by extension, I was in the room where it happened. So you find those moments and you're like, wait, I was here. I was in that room. But one great thing about New Yorkers is we go off onto these tangents, but if you trust us, we come back. So Maria, my best friend, Junot Diaz and the Spanish, the room where it happened. So growing up, I didn't see a lot of books that dealt with that connection of like growing up in a Black and Latino community, in having the intersections of these worlds and what it meant, and wanting to put that story on the page. So I'm going to read Pastels y Benil, and then I'm going to read music. Pastels and Benil is on page 255. And music is on page 262. So as a Muslim, I wasn't allowed to eat pork. And I still don't eat it because I got traumatized out of eating it by my uncle and all his pork stories. So, but Maria, they ate pork. And Benil, you'll find out in this piece, is pork shoulder. When Maria's brother Carlos gets baptized, he is just a tiny baby in a white lace gown with so many $20 bills folded into fans pinned all over it that he looks like a green and white angel. Maria and I stand over his crib talking about all the candy we could buy with just one of those fans, but we know that God is watching and don't even dare touch the money. In the kitchen, there is benil roasting in the oven, the delicious smell filling the house, and Maria says, "You should eat just a little bit." But I am not allowed to eat pork. Instead, I wait for pasteles to get passed around, wait for the one her mother has filled with chicken, for Jackie, mi ahiada, wait for the moment when I can peel the paper away from the crushed plantain-covered meat, break off small pieces with my hands, and let the pastele melt in my mouth. My mother makes the best pasteles in Brooklyn, Maria says. And even though I've only eaten her mom's, I agree. Whenever there is the smell of benil and pasteles on the block, we know there is a celebration going on. And tonight, the party is at Maria's house. The music is loud and the cake is big, and the pasteles that her mother has been making for 3 days are absolutely perfect. We take our food to her stoop just as the grown-ups start dancing merengue, the women lifting their long dresses to show off their fast-moving feet, the men clapping and yelling, "Baila, baila," until the living room floor disappears. When I ask Maria where Diana is, she says, "They're coming later. This part is just for my family." She pulls the crisp skin away from the benil, eats the pork shoulder with rice and beans, our plates balanced on our lap, tall glasses of Malta beside us. And for a long time, neither of us says anything. "Yeah," I say, "this is only for us, the family." And I'm going to end with music. Each morning, the radio comes on at 7 o'clock. Sometimes Michael Jackson is singing that ABC is as easy as 1, 2, 3, or Sly and the Family Stone are thanking us for letting them be themselves, page 262. Sometimes it's slower music, the 5 stair steps telling us that things are going to get easier, or the Holly singing, "He ain't heavy, he's my brother." So on we go. My mother lets us choose what music we want to listen to, as long as the word funk doesn't appear anywhere in the song. But the summer I am 10, funk is in every single song that comes on the cool black radio stations. So our mother makes us listen to the white ones. All afternoon, corny people sing about Colorado, about everything being beautiful, about how we've only just begun. My sister falls in love with the singers, but I sneak off to Maria's house. We're safe inside her room with a pink shag carpet and bunk beds. We can comb our doll's hair and sing along when the Ohio players say he's the funkiest worm in the world. We can dance the funky chicken, tell imaginary intruders to get the funk out of our faces, say the word so hard and so loud and so many times it becomes something different. Something so silly, we laugh just thinking about it. Funky, 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 we sing again and again, until the word is just a sound, not connected to anything, good or bad, right or wrong. Thank you. So this is the part where you get to ask me questions, and nothing you can ask me is wrong. I always want to say that because I think sometimes people, especially in the South, are shyer, or have better home training, and don't want to ask just anything, but nothing you could ask me is wrong, no judgment. With or without the hashtag. Yes?
Okay, so my book club, we read Brown Girl Dreaming before we knew that it was actually for young adults and children. But we enjoyed it. And one of the questions we were all wondering is what happened with your parents, because in the book it seemed like all of a sudden your mom just left.
she was done. So the question is, what happened with my parents? Because all of a sudden it seemed like my mother just left. There are a couple of pieces in the beginning that talk about them arguing and just kind of fracturing, getting fractured. But there was always that pull. They're both very clannish people. So my mother wanted to be back in the South. She always had this longing for the South, and that's why when she's talking to her mother-in-law, Grace, my father's mother, and what she says, Grace is home too, because both of them come from Greenville, South Carolina. But she had this longing to be back home, as did my father, to be in Ohio. So they were from these very different worlds. And they also, my mother was 22 and my father was 24, which is so young. By the time they had 3 children, that was the age they were. And so I think they were too young. They didn't get along. And my father wasn't that kind to her. And I think she was in a very vulnerable position of having left home to go to Ohio to be a part of his family. That was hard for her. So she went back to Greenville, and he stayed in Ohio. And then when they got back together, when I was older, they were much older. So I thought that's when, and they stayed together for about 5 or 6 years before they had never divorced, but they had separated for many years. And so that's when they realized they shouldn't be together, but it made more sense in my eyes for them to try to work through a relationship when they were both old enough. But it was a hard time for them. And I just think, I can't imagine having 3 children and being married at 22. They got married when my mother was 18. She had just finished high school. And then by that time, by 22, she had 3 children. Yes?
Have you always been so eloquent with your words and your writing?
And you have obviously not read my early stuff. I always say people shouldn't read backwards. It's a process, and I think everything I write, from the time I was writing as a young person, I read it out loud. So it had to sound a certain way as well as look a certain way on the page. And the words and the way they sounded matter as much to me, even from a young age, as the story. But it was a lot of rewriting. I rewrite a lot and take out words, get rid of lots of adjectives, and try to get to that point where I can pare the words down to their essence in a way that is both lyrical and meaningful. So, but nah, if you read the early stuff, you'd be like, nah. Even the early stuff that I went back and rewrote once it was republished. So, but reading it side by side, there's some raggedy stuff in there. Anne?
Can you talk about being the Young People's Poet Laureate? What the gig is, how long it lasts, what all you have to do? Because the few things you were saying earlier, I want to know a lot more about it.
So, as Young People's Poet Laureate, I get to make my own platform. Each poet laureate gets to decide what their platform is going to be, and my platform is underserved young people who have never met authors, because I think it's so important for young people to actually see living, breathing authors in the world doing what they do and be able to touch them and ask them questions to see it as a possibility. So there are a number of things. I serve on a number of juries, like for the National Student Poetry Contest, also for a lot of spoken word stuff. On the Poetry Foundation website, each month I select a poem and a book that I think will be valuable to young writers. And then I'm traveling. It's a 2-year term, and I travel to different schools. With my platform, I'm going to schools, I'm going to juvenile detention centers, I'm going to community centers and homeless shelters, and basically spreading the gospel of poetry and showing young people how accessible it can be, because for me as a young person, I thought it was something that was not for me. And I really don't want anyone to ever feel like they don't have access to the written word, especially in places where people have so many stories and don't realize they not only have these stories, but have a right to tell them. So since I started, I went to a bunch of schools in Chicago. I went to a bunch of places in South Carolina. I really would like before the end of my term, but it might bleed over a little bit to hit all 50 states and really talk to, at least access some of it maybe via Skype. I've done a lot of writing back and forth with people, but really to hit all the states and talk to young people in them.
Where do you have the time?
It's hard. It's hard. You know, some of it I'm piggybacking off of this book tour. Some of it is I'll just take a day trip. With Chicago, I flew out that day and came back that night. With South Carolina, I piggybacked off of some brown girl dreaming. And you just make it. Some of it I've taken my family with me because I've missed them so much. And it's like, this is going to be fun. Now they know it's not. So, but, you know, I lie. When I was at Decatur Book, when I was in Georgia, I'm like, come on, this is, we're not going to Georgia. So, but I'm really, it's hard. But the way I see it is, I'm here such a short time in this world, right? And I'm also poet laureate for such a short time. And I feel like there are so many people who don't feel like this platform matters. And so if this is the work, then I have to do the work. And it's hard. It definitely is hard, and it definitely is heartbreaking. I was in juvenile detention centers on the West Coast, and at one point, this little boy, he was so cute. He was leaving, so in the middle of me talking to all these guys, it was all guys, and their orange jumpsuits, and they're so sweet, right? This kid gets up and he's leaving. They're like, yo, you going home? Keep it real, you know, and slap him 5. But not really a lot of fanfare about him going home. And he just kind of walked out. I was like, nice meeting you. Like 15 minutes later, he comes back. He's like, I'm leaving next week. I'm like, oh. But it didn't seem to, you know, he's like 1 week or the next week. But it's interesting. Once I'm in the space, as you know, it's just as, it feeds me. It feeds something in me the same way it feeds them. Like to be able to go there and see what other people might see as stereotype as deeply human and sweet, and just someone who made a couple of wrong choices it definitely grows me in this way. But yeah, it's been nice. I'll be glad to say goodbye to this responsibility. And the Poetry Foundation is very supportive, and will pay for some of the travel, but a lot of the travel I pay for out of the money that they gave me to be poet laureate. So you know there's a catch. You get a cute coin. Yes?
Did you ever go back to the teacher that encouraged you to write?
Did I have teachers that encouraged me to write? I definitely did. Well, I think the first teacher that encouraged me to write was the one who didn't believe I had written something and thought my sister had written it, because my sister, as you find out in Brown Girl Dreaming, is this brilliant student. But the idea that you could write something that's so good they don't even believe you wrote it was, it was an encouragement to me. And I definitely had teachers who saw in me my talent, for lack of a better word. That's what they called it, and encouraged it and let me do stuff. Like if I finished my work in time, they'd let me write. Or if I handed in an assignment or got 100 on a spelling test, they realized that was how they could reward me. And teachers who gave me books to read encouraged me. I feel like you learn to write by reading, right? You learn to write from other authors and copy their style, and eventually you find your own voice, but teachers did help.
She wanted to know if you ever went back and visited one of them. The teacher from the book who, that first one you mentioned, who encouraged you to start writing.
Miss Vivo. I never met Miss Vivo again, which was sad because she was absolutely my favorite teacher. And she had come in when another teacher had left on maternity leave. And then I never know what happened to her.
What's your process for finding your illustrators? Most of your children look just beautiful.
Oh, thank you. So the great thing about my picture books is I get to choose my illustrators. And I'll sit in a library for hours and just go through books. And when I remember choosing E.B., he had a book called The Fire on the Mountain. Was that the title of it? And I saw that book, and I had written The Other Side at that point and chose him for it. And my editor sends him the text and asks him if he wants to illustrate it. Once the illustrator gets the text, you're not allowed to talk to them at all. You're not allowed to say, draw a girl on a tire swing or anything like that, except for Showway. With Showway, Hudson and I worked the whole time because it was a story of my family. But you never know what the illustrations are going to look like. With Pecan Pie Baby, that's not what I expected it to look like. And the reason I hadn't meant for The Other Side to be set back in the past, but E.B. set it back in the past. So when I did Coming On Home Soon, it's like, okay, he knows how to do stuff in the past, so I'll choose him. Any other questions? In the back?
When you do have time to read, who do you like to read?
Who do I like to read? I'm right now reading a book by Naomi Jackson called The Star Side of Bird Hill. I am reading Jason Reynolds' As Brave as You. I'm actually rereading State of Wonder by Anne. I read Commonwealth. I love her writing. Now, I'm not just saying that because she's here. There are a lot of people. I'm trying to think. I read very, very slowly, and I'm a poly reader. So I just read The Way to the Spring. I finished that, Ben Ehrenreich, Life and Death in Palestine. So, but I read pretty widely. I like nonfiction and fiction, and I read a lot of young adult literature when I'm not writing. When I'm writing, I read adult literature, and also I'm reading Colson's book. Colson Whitehead, The Underground Railroad, but I had to stop because it got violent, so.
Did you read Underground Airline?
No, who's that?
Ben Winters?
I'll
ask you later.
Underground Airline?
Yeah.
No.
They came out like 2 weeks apart.
From Colson's?
No. Yeah, the railroad and the airline came out 2 weeks apart.
Oh, wow. I have not heard of that one at all. Oh, poor Ben. I might have to buy that. From Parnassus.
In another Brooklyn, when August was describing Bushwick, and even in the dark descriptions of Bushwick, there was still a lot of lush, colorful language. Did you go back to Bushwick to revisit places to help you remember?
You know, Bushwick has changed so much since I was a child there. And I still have the house, that I grew up in, because after my mom passed, she left it to me. Not because I was her favorite, but I think she thought I was the most responsible. But so I'm on that block a lot. And I have a lot of friends who still live in that area. But when I started researching Bushwick, I went to the Brooklyn Historical Society, and everything was devastating. What they wrote about was the blackout and the looting and the fires and the gangs. I'm like, really, people? This is all the information? And I remember there was a guy who would come around and just take lots of photographs of the kids of the neighborhood. And I have one from when I was 14 that he took, and a bunch of my friends. And so what I really started doing was looking at all these photographs that were more loving of the neighborhood. I went to friends' houses and we looked at pictures of ourselves as children. And then really tried to remember all the good stuff, because I think that was a lot of the information coming out of Bushwick was about the quote-unquote devastation, and no one was looking at the way that was not what it was for the people who lived there. So that's how I got inside of it. But of course, then the blackout, looking at the blackout from how August saw it, and looking at the looting from how August saw it. And the fires, there's a part about her talking about the neighborhood being a matchbox and stuff. Last question.
I was going to ask you, I heard you say all the different authors that you read. Are there any that influence your writing, or are there any authors that...
Everyone I read influences my writing. And I think that's the great thing. We talk a lot about, again and again, about how you really can't be a writer if you're not a reader. So if you're writing fantasy, you have to be reading fantasy. If you're writing poetry, I didn't even get to the poets I love. You have to be reading poetry. And when I read a good book, I'm like, I want to do that. I I want to write that well. I want to pause in my language. One thing that's great about Naomi Jackson's Star Side of Bird Hill is it takes place in Barbados. And so many turns of phrases that are very Caribbean, you know, and I'm not Caribbean, so I don't know how that happens, but she catches it. She catches the lilt of them, of the people, and the way they she turn phrases that just kind of blows my mind. And I can't do that. I don't have that in my cachet. My grandmother spoke very clearly, and the only one I remember is "I'm going to knock the fire out of you." So, and that means you were going to get a spanking. And of course, thinking about that, like, wow, she wanted to knock the fire out of me, which means I had a fire, right? So, but it was a very Southern thing to say. But looking at her language, kind of, because I've been listening to that one as an audiobook, it stays with me. But I really do learn from every single writer I read, the good ones. And I don't finish books if I don't love them. I'm one of those kind of writers. My partner finishes everything. I'm like, life is too short. So the writers I've read, not only did I love them, but I finished their books. Thanks, everyone.